Bonjour, distinguished members of the Canadian Parliament, merci. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the vital need to continue to expand and tighten export controls against the Russian Federation in response to its ongoing brutal invasion of Ukraine. Merci de m'avoir invité à Ottawa.
Thank you for inviting me to Ottawa to speak today to you. I'm a researcher in astrophysics in Pennsylvania.
I previously served as European Energy Security Advisor at the U.S. Department of State. I'm currently a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, a fellow for democratic resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, and the co-founder of the Duke University Space Diplomacy Lab. We meet today less than 48 hours after the very latest unthinkable terror was unleashed by Putin's Kremlin against the Ukrainian people. The destruction of the Novakhovka Dam and hydroelectric power plant in Russian-occupied Kherson, an act that unleashed widespread energy and water insecurity, ecological disaster, and sharply exacerbated the Russia-fabricated humanitarian nightmare that is unleashed across Ukraine. Although shocking, Moscow's latest attack on Ukrainian critical infrastructure shouldn't take us by surprise. It's just the most recent example in its campaign of kinetic strikes against Ukrainian energy facilities over the past 16 months, and a clear extension of Russia's years-long policy of weaponizing energy supplies against the European democracies. We also meet here at a historic inflection point during Russia's war in Ukraine, a moment in which heroic Ukrainian defenders are already in the opening stages of a highly anticipated military counteroffensive aimed at ending Russian military occupation within Ukraine's internationally recognized sovereign territory. The success of the counteroffensive will not just come down to the unparalleled bravery of Ukrainian service personnel, it will also be the military hardware and materiel that we as Western democracies have been able to supply that will play a decisive role. This is why countries like Canada must continue to rapidly improve the pace and supply and scope of military systems it's sending to Ukraine and ensure that increasing Canada's technical capacity for defense manufacturing and procurement is prioritized in Ottawa's highly anticipated defense policy update. But while supporting the success of Ukraine's military counteroffensive is essential, global democracies supporting Kyiv have the duty to lead a counteroffensive of their own, a counteroffensive of sanctions to further ratchet up economic and supply chain pressure to degrade Russia's capability to wage war against its democratic neighbor. With this in mind, we can look at three critical lessons we've learned over the past year or so on the Russian sanctions regime. First, the answer to the perennial question of are Russia sanctions working is yes, but given the wide range of measures deployed, we need to also consider the proper timescales required for these various classes of sanctions to have their desired impact. For example, while banking restrictions and energy sanctions might take longer to result in broad macroeconomic failures in the Russian economy, technology export controls on component and systems-level military and dual-use hardware have resulted in more immediate impediments to Russia's military-industrial capacity, forcing it to seek equipment from countries like Iran. Regardless, both sanctions tracks must be strengthened and held in place for the long term to live up to the transatlantic pledge of increasing costs on Putin's Kremlin in support of Ukrainian victory. Second, the transatlantic community can never again be fooled by dubious Kremlin schemes and disinformation campaigns to waive existing prudent sanctions measures. Both during the run-up to the Kremlin's large-scale invasion of Ukraine and during its first year, sanctions measures were either already enforced or that were on the books to be, were waived, avoided, or otherwise unutilized. This includes the Biden administration's July 2021 decision to waive sanctions on the Kremlin-backed Nord Stream 2 pipeline, sanctions that were legally mandated by an overwhelming bipartisan majority in both chambers of U.S. Congress for years. It also includes the decision later in 2021 by the Biden administration to avoid sanctioning a vessel called the Blue Ship. This vessel was engaged in sanctionable activities in the construction of Nord Stream 2, but sanctions were waived, citing the ship's ownership by an entity that was quasi-owned by the German state government of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, though principally funded by the Gazprom-owned Nord Stream 2 consortium, an entity cynically called a climate foundation. The ship and its owner remain unsanctioned today. And of course, it also includes last year's decision by the Canadian government to waive Russia technology export controls measures on a set of Siemens gas turbines that the Putin regime erroneously claimed was technically needed to end its politically motivated cuts of Nord Stream 1. Thankfully, the Trudeau government ultimately reversed this decision in part due to the great work of this very committee. Strategic errors like these, along with many further examples, will only serve to embolden Putin's Kremlin to set up schemes to undermine Western sanctions consensus, and if left uncorrected, could cause grave harm to broad counter-threat financing programs developed by global democracies. Third and finally, simply announcing strong sanctions measures without equally strong tracking and enforcement actions of would-be sanctions evaders will not get the job done. The wide array of Russian sanctions and export controls measures that have been announced by the G7, European Union, and beyond over the past 16 months are commendable, but must be rigorously increased and enforced until the Kremlin relents in its war of choice against Ukraine. It's no exaggeration that the scale and scope of sanctions already in place against the Russian Federation represents perhaps the largest single sanctions regime ever undertaken in history, in large part due to the sheer size of Russia's landmass, economic activity, and global
Mr. Schmitt,
connections.
if I could ask you to conclude in the next 20 seconds, please.
Yes. So there are many sanctions measures that need immediate rollout, which I will provide a menu during this hearing. But in closing, the biggest lesson we should have learned over the past 16 months is that the cycle of incrementalist measures to support Ukraine, whether it be on the supply of weapon systems urgently needed by Kyiv or on sanctions measures, needs to be broken. The time for incrementalism is over. A Western sanctions counteroffensive with stronger and wider restrictions on the Russian Federation can and must be deployed immediately. Global democracies must do this not only to support the future resiliency of a free Ukraine, but also to make it abundantly clear to the realist it's just a commercial deal block, that there cannot be a return to business as usual with the Putin regime. It's a vital message that authoritarian regimes around the world will need to hear as well. Thank you for your attention, and I look